On November 25, 1120, William Adelin, the heir to the English throne, was crossing the English Channel in the Blanche Neuf, the most modern ship in the royal fleet at the time. William and his friends had been partying for hours and got drunk together with the crew. The king had set sail hours before, so the crew tried to go as fast as possible to try to catch up. However, after having barely left the Barfleur harbor, the ship hit a rock and started sinking. According to a man who survived the disaster, William's bodyguards rushed him into a rowing boat to get him to safety. But seeing one of his sisters drowning, he went back to try to save her. He managed to grab her, but other desperate people also tried to get on the boat, sinking it and killing William and his sister. His death was a disaster to England and would lead to a civil war that lasted decades, a period known as the Anarchy. William's father, King Henry I, had a number of children, but only two were legitimate: his son William and a daughter named Matilda. So his death left the king without a male heir, and Henry tried to fix that by remarrying. But he and his new wife didn't have any children, so he started looking for an heir in his existing family. His daughter Matilda was married to the Holy Roman Emperor, but in 1125 her husband died, leaving her a widow. Since she had no children, she returned to England, and Henry decided to name her his successor and made his barons swear fealty to her. Henry didn't do this because he believed in gender equality, but because it was a way to maintain his bloodline in power, with her being his only legitimate child. Still, many in England were opposed to Matilda being the successor to the crown, given that she was a woman. In 1128, at the request of her father, Matilda married Geoffrey Plantagenet, heir to the County of Anjou. Matilda wasn't too keen on this marriage, given that Geoffrey was much younger than her, and that she had previously been the Holy Roman Empress and now was being downgraded to a countess. But despite all this, she carried on with the marriage, and after a few years, the couple would have 3 sons. On December 1st, 1135, Henry died, and a war started over the succession. Even though Henry had named Matilda his successor, he didn't want to hand over castles to her, which could have strengthened her position. And many still didn't like the idea of a woman ruling England out of her own right. But even though women in her time weren't given much of an education, Matilda was educated and had experience as a ruler. During her time in the Holy Roman Empire, she studied Latin and German and learned about the customs and laws of the country. She also took an active role as empress, ruling as regent, sponsoring royal grants, and dealing with petitioners. When Henry died, Matilda was in Anjou. Meanwhile, one of her cousins, Stephen of Blois, was in Boulogne by the English Channel and moved quickly to seize the throne for himself. Henry died on December 1st, and on December 22nd, Stephen was already being crowned the next king of England. Stephen gained the support of the Londoners in return for his promise of protection and of the church, since his younger brother, also named Henry, was the Bishop of Winchester, an important political center at the time and one of the richest sees in England. Henry was fundamental in gaining the church's support for Stephen's claim to the throne. In return, Stephen granted more freedoms to the church in England. However, not everyone supported Stephen as a king, most notably King David I of Scotland. David was Matilda's uncle from her mother's side and supported her claim to the throne. By the end of December, he had raised a large army and invaded England from the north, and by the end of January, he was able to seize 5 strategic castles: Carlisle, Newcastle upon Tyne, Wark, Alnwick, and Norham. Stephen's reply was swift. He took a large army north and met with David in Durham. The two were able to reach an agreement that allowed David to retain some of the territory he had taken, but in return his son would pay homage to Stephen. This show of strength increased the support for Stephen, but unfortunately for him, he wouldn't be as successful handling the next crisis of his reign. Rebellion broke out in different parts of his kingdom. In the southwest of England, one of his nobles seized Exeter, which led to Stephen laying siege to the town. Although successful, the siege was long, lasting nearly 3 months and very expensive. There was also rebellion in Wales, and Stephen was unable to defeat the rebels, and after months of fighting, eventually gave up on reconquering Wales. In addition, many of his barons saw him as being too lenient with his enemies, which encouraged more rebellions in their view. Meanwhile, Matilda's husband, Geoffrey, used this time to invade Normandy, which during this period was under the control of the King of England. Geoffrey invaded and plundered Normandy, and in 1137 Stephen crossed the Channel and initially defeated Geoffrey, but shortly after his army started to fall apart because of internal divisions, and he was forced to come to a truce. As part of it, Stephen agreed to pay Geoffrey 2,000 marks per year. Stephen started to be seen as an unreliable king who couldn't successfully defeat his enemies, and was also running out of money, since his campaigns had been quite costly. With this in mind, many of his nobles started to look at another leadership option, Matilda. She had never renounced her claim to the throne and had some powerful supporters. One of them was Robert of Gloucester. He was her half-brother and could have inherited the crown if he wasn't an illegitimate son of Henry I. He was also one of the most powerful barons in England and Normandy, controlling a number of castles. In 1138, he declared his support for Matilda, which led to rebellions against Stephen in the west of England, in Gloucester and in Bristol. Meanwhile, the Scots invaded the north of England once again. Stephen was able to defeat the invaders, but soon he would have a much bigger problem. In 1139, Matilda crossed the Channel to England, together with Robert. At this point, much of Normandy was under their control, and now was the time to seize the throne. She went to Arundel Castle, which was the residency of her stepmother, Henry's second wife. Stephen initially laid siege to the castle, but then gave Matilda safe passage to meet with Robert in Bristol. It's unclear what led Stephen to do this, but this would prove to be a mistake. Gradually, some important nobles defected to Matilda's side, and on 1141 her forces attacked Stephen's army while they were laying siege to Lincoln Castle. Not only did Matilda win the battle, but she also captured Stephen himself. This was a major victory for her, and she quickly moved to have herself crowned as queen and was given the title of Lady of England and Normandy. Her coronation had been planned for June in London, a city that still had a lot of supporters of Stephen. On June, shortly before her coronation, the Londoners revolted against her. She was forced to flee the city and ended up never being crowned as queen. Much of the criticism she received during the time was due to the fact that she was a woman, and her critics believed that she didn't behave as women were supposed to, criticizing her lack of modesty. To make matters worse for Matilda, later that same year, Robert was captured. He was her most significant and loyal supporter, so she was forced to make an agreement to switch Stephen for Robert. After being released, Stephen had himself recrowned to re-establish his power as king. It was important to Stephen to re-establish his power and control over the kingdom, because amid the civil war, the system of government was very much fragmented. Many castles started being built all over the country, often being used to extort money from the local people by kidnapping them for ransom or torturing them for what they owned. The lawlessness also led to villages being plundered, making it harder for farmers to grow and harvest their crops, and caused a shortage of some foods, leading to famine in some parts of the country. Barons also started minting their own coins and enforcing their own laws. A chronicler from the time said that Christ and his saints slept. However, Stephen still had to focus on fighting Matilda's forces. By 1143, the war had reached a stalemate, and by the end of the decade, very little fighting was being done. In 1147, Matilda's greatest supporter, Robert, died, and in the following year she decided to return to Normandy, where she would spend the rest of her life. She had accepted that she would not be Queen of England, but this didn't mean the end of the war. In 1151, Matilda's husband, Geoffrey, died, and their eldest son and heir, Henry, who was already 18 years old, secured his control over Normandy and Anjou. Finally, on 1153, after having recently married Eleanor of Aquitaine, one of the most powerful women in Europe, Henry went to England to take the English throne. He had already been to England taking part of the war, and had a number of supporters who saw him as the lawful heir to the English throne. Henry and his forces marched to Malmesbury and laid siege to it. Stephen sent an army to put an end to the siege, but the harsh winter conditions and the flooded river that separated the two armies allowed Henry to escape a battle and capture the castle. Fighting continued, but nobles on both sides weren't interested in fighting a direct battle that could put a decisive end to the war, and agreed to a temporary truce. However, during the truce, Stephen suffered a major blow. His son and heir, Eustace, died unexpectedly. Stephen still had another son named William, but after over a decade of fighting and no perspective of winning the war, Stephen agreed to peace talks with Henry. They agreed that Henry would recognize Stephen as king, but that Stephen would declare Henry as his heir, and William would renounce his claim to the throne, but would be allowed to retain his lands. We cannot know whether or not Stephen intended to keep the terms of the treaty or to fight on, but in the end, the treaty was a victory for Henry, because he wouldn't have to wait too long to become king. Stephen died nearly a year after, on 1154, and on December 19th that same year, Henry II was crowned King of England. After finally putting an end to the war, Henry was able to restore the government and order in his kingdom. He was the first king of the Plantagenet dynasty, one of England's greatest dynasties, and ruled over a large part of France. Meanwhile, Matilda remained in Normandy, where she governed as Henry's representative and advised him on government issues. If you like this video, consider sharing it and subscribing for more content. You can also watch our last video if you haven't seen it already, and I'll see you in the next one.